Good morning. So, in disaster management, today we are going to do is uh, principle of disaster risk reduction. The key role of public health preparedness and awareness program is that how we can reduce and address various areas that can be helpful in reduction of the risk, the rise of the risk of or the vulnerability of the people residing in these areas, right? Wha- what and when disaster occurs, let's understand first, right, what is disaster risk. Risk is when you are having hazard and vulnerability. Okay, so and hazard and vulnerability when there is a existing threat, always hazard is always a threat in any natural hazard, like there's a you know chances of floods happening, and we have earthquakes, that is a hazard all by itself. But when uh, you know earthquake meets the vulnerability areas, that is the populous areas or densely populous areas, and the capacity is reduced because the faulty construction maybe, or the dense population, unaware or unprepared community will give rise to risk, right? So when we are talking about disaster risk management, we are talking about is whether it is uh, how much we are proximate or close to a hazard, what are the areas that are exposing us to various disasters, are what disaster risk is. So disaster risk are sometimes considered or external shock, but disaster, it results from a complex interaction between developmental processes that generates conditions like of exposure, vulnerability, and hazard. So disaster risk is therefore considered as combination of severity and what you called frequency of any hazard that is occurring. So how severe that hazard is happening and how frequent it is happening, that is what a disaster risk depends on, right? So then the number of people and the asset exposed, or are basically yeah the number of people which are exposed to or elements which are exposed to the hazard, and their vulnerability to damage, to losses, are again part of disaster risk. Now in intensive risk is your disaster risk associated with low probability and high impact event. Okay, so whereas extensive risk is associated with high probability and low impact event, there is no such thing, like we call it the low impact, the losses is not there. It is either whether the losses will be low, or it will be with a high intensity impact, the loss could be low. Why? Maybe your community is well prepared and resilient. The losses and the impact that characterize the disaster usually have much to do with the exposure and the vulnerability of the people and the place, as they do with the severity of the hazardous event. So disaster risk may characterize, in order to understand disaster disaster risk and essential elements, that is we are looking way forward, uh, that is the likelihood of the losses of life, destruction and damages in the given period of time. Then dynamic effects, that is it can increase or decrease according to the ability to reduce the vulnerability. Then you have visibility, or visible, how it is comprised of not only the threat that is high impact event, but also the frequent or low impact event that can come as an hidden, like slow onset of disasters, like dry spells. Continuous dry spell will lead to a drought like situation. So that is a if you see the frequency of dry spells, like consecutively, if it is consecutively happening to several seasons together, it will lead to drought. And a drought is all by itself is a disaster, as we have suggested earlier, we talked earlier. So the frequency will lead to low impact event, and is often has a slow onset of losses. Okay, so eventually the distributed around the earth, the hazard affect different areas, but the pattern of disaster risk reflects the social construction and exposed and vulnerability in different countries. The engagement and the complexity is that many processes include climate change, globalization, or global economic development, are creating new interaction and new areas of diaspora of risk elements, or elements which are exposed to the hazards. Okay. uh, then we come to the next thing is that, just a minute. Yeah. So when we are talking about risk, disaster threatens development, and just as development creates disaster risk, we need to understand that the vulnerability of natural disaster, that is about 95% of national disaster death, occur among 66% of the poorest countries. So from so Anderson in 1992 had said that in 95% of the national disaster that occurs among the 66% of the poorest countries. And from 1965 to 1992, more than 90% of all disaster victims lived or have survived the, are in the areas from Asia and Africa. It was as per the, report of IDNDR in 1994. Now, when we are talking about disaster risk management cycle, just a minute, I'll just get back to you. Yeah. So, uh, in disaster management cycle, we see that prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. If we are prepared pre-hand, the losses will be very less. It is always advisable, or it is wise to see that we prepare for the disaster in pre-hand. Okay, if the post disaster reaction will curtail to more losses, more victims, and plus it will have a non-sustainable developmental activities that will be going on in the post disaster SAR operations. So disaster threatens development, just as development creates disaster. Okay, so the key to understand disaster risk is by recognizing the disaster are an indicator of developmental feature failures. So for a sustainable developmental aid, it says that a disaster is basically threatens development, and it is due to the developmental activities the disaster has been created. Like when we say this, there is no such thing as a natural disaster, but a disaster often followed by natural hazards. So when we are talking about natural disaster, it is not a disaster until unless when we are, it is coming across the human aspect, anthropogenic aspect. So a disaster is often initiated, what we call it natural disaster is often initiated due to the natural hazard, but but eventually it becomes a disaster only when it comes in contact with human or anthropogenic elements, right? So coming back to this, when we are understanding this, that uh, the key indicators of developmental failures, which means that disaster risk is a measure of sustainable development. So when we are consecutively, when like for example, urban disaster was of many kinds that we have understood, but urban disaster, why? Because whenever we are doing indulging into developmental activities, we are not considering, like for in case of urban flooding. What happens in urban flooding? We are not looking for a sustainable or a developmental activities or process in context to natural features of the natural drainage system of that area. So when we have construction over a natural drainage pattern of that region, we are obstructing the flow of the water that is going to come eventually due to heavy rainfall or a river influx. So what will happen is that it will cause flood like situation. It will cause stagnant water in the um, uh, urban sectors, resulting many folds, which is like a domino. It is like a chain reaction, result giving out many other problems that can turn into disasters, like waterborne diseases and vector-borne diseases. uh, then you will have a prolonged stagnant water can result into losses of properties, and disruption of livelihood. So that's why it is said that is a disaster, that is it but the key understanding of disaster risk is by recognizing the disasters are an indicator of developmental failure. So means that the disaster risk is a measure of the sustainability of developmental activity. So how your developmental activity, how sustainable it is with in coherence with the nature, because nature will always find its way, right? So how sustainable your developmental activity is, that indicates that what is the amount of disaster that you are going to face, and how you're going to withstand it. So hazard, vulnerability, and exposure are influenced by number of risk drivers, including poverty and inadequacy, bad planning, and managed urban and regional developmental activities. So climate change and environmental degradation will also be another part that adds on to the unsustainable developmental activities. Now, understanding disaster risk requires us to not only consider the hazard, our exposure and vulnerability, but also the community, the society's capacity to protect itself from disaster. The ability of communities, society, and systems to assist or absorb and accommodate a disaster, or accommodate the amount of pressure or stress they can take, the recovery from the losses, and withstand the same time improve the well-being and the well-being of the community and the people, and also develop a resilience against that hazard or that disaster, to if it doesn't follow up to anymore. What does disaster risk matters to? Why do we have to understand disaster risk, right? So if we say if the current global pattern of increasing exposure and high level of inadequate and rapidly urban developmental activities and environmental degradation grows, the disaster risk may increase and at a to a dangerous level, right? So what, like for example, if we have not if had we considered the global warming in a correct period of time, uh, we would have stopped from many severe cyclones that are erupting in Indian Ocean in these last 5 years. If you see, in last 5 years, Indian Ocean is developing severe cyclones. So earlier it was known that Arabian Sea was known for to be calmer sea in Indian subcontinent. But in past 5 years we can see that apart from Bay of Bengal having severe cyclones, we are also facing severe cyclonic storms in the in Arabian Sea. And not only that, we are in developing two troughs of cyclonic storms, that is pre-monsoon and post-monsoon season. So if you see, in in just short period of time, we are seeing the change that within the 5 years we are seeing the frequency of cyclones are very high. Like it is like last 5 years I can see this what the cyclonic storms, the cyclonic depression is converting into extreme cyclonic storms within 24 hours in a quite alarming speed, right? So it is a indicator that the Indian Ocean water is rising in temperature, because a cyclone, to sustain its speed and its spinning, needs temperature. The higher the temperature of the surface, the more speed it takes, because cyclone is a way of disseminating the energy that is there on the surface. So whenever the ocean surface is heated up, it is one of the techniques of disseminating that energy into the atmosphere. So uh, usually Arabian Sea, sorry, Indian Ocean should have a temperature between 20 degrees Celsius. um, but nowadays the temperature has risen to, it is recording, it is crossing over 25 degrees Celsius. It is almost 30 degrees Celsius, the temperatures of the temperature of the Indian Ocean. And that is why it is initiating these massive cyclonic storms. So that's why we need to understand, to understand disaster risk, we need to understand the global pattern and the increasing exposure. So like I have given an example of cyclone, there are other hazards that also have a particular pattern, that why these frequencies are increasing. So high level of inequality and rapid urban development and environment degradation grows the disaster risk and may increase the danger, increase to a very dangerous level. Right. So the global average of annual loss is estimated to increase up to 415 US dollars. Right. So now as if we are seeing, like, just hold on. Yeah. So and evolution in approaches have also initiated, like from response to relief and risk reduction activities. uh, what is a disaster risk reduction? The concept of a conceptual framework of elements with possibilities to minimize hazard, vulnerability, and disaster risk prevention and mitigation, and also prepare for any adverse impact of hazard with a broad context of sustainable development. Okay, so risk reduction versus risk management. Let's talk about risk reduction versus risk management. Risk management is prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Whereas risk management is once the thing has happened, that means reducing risk reduction will implement prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. But reduction will also include pre-disaster and preemptive part of the developments, right? So risk reduction cycle will be, first we start with risk assessment, risk hazard analysis, vulnerability analysis, then we go to risk assessment, then risk reduction and sustainable developmental activities. That is the entire cycle of risk reduction. Okay, so when we are talking about risk reduction cycle, first of all, we need to have an hazard analysis. Okay, what are the hazards that are there? What is the degree of hazards that is existing in that region? The proximity of the anthropogenic elements to the hazard, the exposure. Proximity means exposure, and then what are the areas or which are the elements which are vulnerable to these hazards turning into disaster. And then when we are having hazard and hazard analysis and vulnerability analysis, we come up to a result that what are the risk assessments. We get a result as risk assessment. What are the sectors, what are the loopholes, gap holes, that is pertaining the risk of losses. Risk reduction is when hazard mitigation activities can be initiated and vulnerability reduction activities. Like hazard mitigation, like if in case you are talking about river flood, you can, in an area where the rivers are flooding almost every year, you can develop big levees. Artificial levees can prevent the embankment of rivers, so that it does not go and flow into the agriculture sector or the urban sector or settlement areas. So that is one of the structural mitigation activities that can reduce the hazard. Then vulnerability reduction can be done by giving training programs, mock drills, awareness camps, and assistance can reduce the vulnerability, can part as a vulnerability reduction. Okay, sustainable development, again, like in current and in coordination with natural drainage pattern, natural vegetation, anything which is naturally existing. When we are doing an a developmental activity with in context to that, we will have a better developmental activity, more sustainable developmental activities, right? Like if there is a river which has a tendency of flooding every year due to heavy rainfall, so it's better not to have any construction around those rivers, because eventually that river will require the certain area to swell. So we will leave that area, we can generate a buffer system and draw a artificial levee. So and beyond that we can have our construction, so that whenever the river swells, it does not cross that barrage. Then we have hazard, and again we come back to hazard analysis and we revise the entire cycle. The approach to risk reduction is an integrated emergency management approach, and hazard identification and risk management includes the vulnerable analysis, and that is you set the priorities. What are the first thing that has to be identified as vulnerable sectors that has the risk of losses. Then mitigation and prevention strategies can be used as reduce in to reduce the impact. So mitigation and prevention activities can be inculcated to reduce the impact. Then you have, if hazard remains and still if there is a risk remaining there, you have the preparedness education programs. Then you have contingency planning, effective response, and fast recovery activities in these areas. And then, what is preparedness? A pre-disaster action that results in person knowing what to do and how to respond when disaster occurs. So, pre-disaster action that results in person knowing that what to do and how to respond during that hazard or disaster, um, prevents a lot of time, and also preserve a lot of losses. Like it is long term, whether it is a long term hazard that effect that can happen, the part of a larger risk reduction program. It can be part of comprehensive application of sustainable development. All hazard can be included into it, and multi-sectoral aspects or approach can be taken up to address that hazard. Culturally sensitive and specific type of activities can be implemented in areas, because every region have their different culture aspects, and cultural diversity has to be followed during disaster preparedness. Then objective of public health emergency preparedness has to be implemented, prevent morbidity or mortality, then provide care for casualties, manage diverse climatic and environmental condition, ensure restoration of normal health, re-establish health services, and protect the health service staffs and various staffs, for important services that are given, like whether it is supply, water supply, sanitation, health. All these sectors have to protect the staff first. The staff needs to be given training and drills and awareness regarding the essential part, and what are the roles during the emergency they can take up. Then protect the public health and medicinal assets are also part of public health emergency preparedness. Now, Kim's, said there are 11 E's of emergency preparedness. That is, economic initiatives, epidemiology, enforcement of codes, emergency plan, equipment stockpiling, education, exercises or drills and trainings, early warning system, evacuation, evaluation, and electronic or communication system. So the 11 E's are, first we have economic initiative. So you need some economic assistance and initiative to uh, do a more sustainable developmental activities, and inventories checkup. Then epidemiology, preventing the epidemic that can arise due to the disasters, like any disaster which has is causing death and mortality. The dead bodies will, or the contaminated water or waste disposal will initiate certain diseases which can be prevented. So epidemiology can be very useful in this case. How this can turn into an epidemic, like if, dengue and malaria during flood can be an epidemic. Similarly, cholera or typhoid can be an epidemic during flood situation or even earthquakes, right? Then enforcement of food codes, the codes like building codes, structural codes, other norms that has to be followed. So enforcement of those codes and norms has to be implemented. Then emergency plan, they should always have an emergency plan for public health, for various sectors, for public health, for power department, for water, food and sanitation, health sectors like hospitals should have their own emergency plan to keep the results of the last victims and equipment like what are the you know, education, education, on top of it, human activities can put put more stress to these natural hazards and causing turning it into a disaster. Exercises and drills, warning system, with exercises, drills and mock drills and training will provide a practice among the community members and among the key stakeholders who are going to act during the disaster, will give them a more their action will have a more prominent response to the disaster. The more prompt a response you have towards the disaster, the better or more lives or more prevention you can do. All right. Then you have early warning system. Early warning system will also again help in preventing the losses. So early warning system, whenever there is an early warning issue given to affected the areas that can come under threat, people can be evacuated in time. So early warning system will next be initiated by evacuation. A proper way of evacuation will reduce the losses of life, may not be property but or losses of right. Evacuation, and then we have to evaluate what is the extent of loss, what are the areas that has lost, what is the intensity, and how it can curtail. Then you can have like any disaster, it can result into disruption of flow of communication. So reestablishment of communication channel is very essential for providing SAR operation and to prevent more losses. Risk management is probability of suffering damage to property, economic disruption, and from a hazard of a given area and different period. The risk is product of hazard and vulnerability. Disaster risk management can be defined as the process of defining, analysis, and quantifying the probability of the losses in order to undertake preventive, or corrective actions. This involves two types of activities: planning actions to reduce vulnerability in areas where risk can be controlled, and establishing protective mechanism against the potential economic losses from uncontrollable factors of natural hazards. Disaster risk management is essential effort for measures put in place to reduce the risk in case of disaster happening. uh, this is generally termed as disaster risk reduction, and is about the commitment and related to disaster vulnerability and risk reduction involvement and improvement in early warning system. So risk continues since it is it can be done and prevent occurrence of natural hazards action and activity. It should focus in reducing the existing and future vulnerability to damages and losses. There are three primary and interrelated categories in risk management, that is, risk identification, risk reduction, and risk transfer. These measures are mostly related to pre-disaster phases of disaster risk management and reflect a few approach in disaster risk reduction activities. The pre-disaster phase of disaster risk management involves four distinct but interrelated components, that is risk identification, risk reduction, mitigation, and risk transfer and preparedness. It is although an analysis of existing vulnerability, location, severity, and intensity of the threats. Risk identification follows the activity that helps to identify and understand natural hazard. So, hazard data collection and mapping, frequency, magnitude, and location, vulnerable assessment, and risk management or risk assessment are part of it. Vulnerable assessment will include population and asset exposed, and risk assessment probability of expected losses. Risk mitigation is measured to take the element to reduce the intensity of hazardous event, and these measure addresses existing vulnerability through measures that is it is likely to further warning, and include actions such as implementation and enforcement of building standards, environmental protection measures, management practices, and mention of others. It can also be reduced through future understanding the future vulnerability. So even risk reduction preparedness is important. So even when effective disaster reduce measures in are in places, there would be often an element of risk that is residual or cannot be managed, because it is either too costly or too technically unfeasible to eliminate altogether. So preparedness in an important component in disaster risk reduction, which deals with residual and managing or management of risks. Risk transferences, there are mechanism which aim at reducing the actual vulnerability to financial risk. So ensure that the funds are available when the losses occur for disaster, when it disaster happens. So risk transfer mechanism are often insufficient for cost preventive, and so it is important to take all the necessary measure to reduce the vulnerability of assets to be covered for before transferring of the risks. So this is all. Then we have again, yeah, risk transference is, without getting into details, the main risk transference and risk finance methods are marketing insurance, various insurance and reinsurance policies, budgets and self insurance, and allocation of small portion of budget for self sustenance, community insurance, household and living insurance mechanisms. Then we come to Hugo framework, working on risk reduction. The Hugo framework of action assists that um, efforts of national and community to become more resilient, to cope better with hazard they face, although the primary responsibility of its implication rest with government and collaboration of cooperation between all stakeholders, and managing the risk is crucial. Hugo conference also ensures that the disaster risk reduction is an national and local priorities, and identify the assess and monitor the disaster risk and enhance the early warning. So the use knowledge and involvement and education to build a culture of safety and resilient at all level. So reduce the underlying risk factors and strengthen the disaster preparedness for effective response at all level. Community and sub-country, district, regional and national level will pertain to it. So the need of mainstreaming the pre-hazard risk management is that its frequency and magnitude of loss from natural disaster have been constantly increasing. So the losses of this recent natural disaster have been a great deal of higher than the other losses that had happened. So this trend of expected is continuing to rise, and in a concentrated population uh, and property in area that are susceptible to natural hazard. So every year this concentration is, and economic losses are rising. If you see here, this graph is showing, like from 1950 to 2000, 15, we are seeing that there is a considerable rise, and the trend of rise in economic losses that is happening due to the natural disaster. So hazard risk management framework inculcating emergency preparedness, institutional capacity building, catastrophic risk financing, and risk management instruments are implemented here. So disaster risk modeling process will calculate the hazard coefficient for, stochastic event that is generated. And then we have, it calculates the vulnerability and exposure of the areas that is against the disaster. Thirdly, we will have the calculated the losses of the disasters. This is an image which shows that land use wise distribution of population, and also the vulnerable interaction of flood extent. So if you see here, there is a river here, and the more the population, this is showing density of population. So here, if this is the high density population in this region, and these region will be more vulnerable to the flooding, because they are more exposed to these areas. So this is all like we can use GIS simulated uh, data analysis and maps to generate more areas that are risk to various disasters. So this is a case study that I have shown you. We can take similar studies for various disasters that are there. And I would write, we finish off with this lecture, and I will like all of you to go to your LMS and take the quiz.